The sound came from somewhere up the path to the east. Low and steady, somewhere between a moan and a rumble, with a rhythm that said it had been going for a while. Theo stopped walking and listened. The forest was deep into its evening sounds, the canopy settling, the night birds starting up, but this was underneath all of that. Something large. He left the path and followed it into the dark. The mama bear was on her side, pinned under a fallen oak. The tree had come down across her lower back, not crushing but holding, and she had been working against it long enough that the earth around her was torn up in a wide circle. 3 cubs were pressed against her belly, very small, born this season. One of them was scratching at the bark of the fallen tree with its tiny claws, pulling at it, doing nothing useful, and doing it anyway. Theo crouched at the edge of the clearing and looked at the scene. Theo was lean across the shoulders and brown from the sun, his dark hair pushed back from his face, his hands rough at the knuckles from work. He had an ordinary face, a straight nose, a jaw that needed a shave, the kind of features that assembled themselves into something forgettable until he smiled. When he smiled, something moved in it that hadn't been there a moment before. He wasn't smiling now. He was looking at the tree, and the bear, and the cubs, and doing the math. "Oh boy," he said, and set his pack down. He looked at the angle of the fall and the position of the trunk and the distance to the narrowest section. "It's going to be a long night," he said, already calculating which section of the trunk to cut first. He took a step into the clearing. All 3 cubs spun toward him immediately. The largest one, which was still roughly the size of a large cat, puffed itself up to its full height and made a sound that was clearly intended to be threatening. The other 2 flanked it. Tiny, round, absolutely committed to the threat display. Theo stopped, holding both hands out with his palms open. Okay, I'm not here for you." The largest cub charged him. It covered the distance between them at full speed and ran directly into his shin with a soft thud and bounced back and shook its head and charged again. Theo looked down at it. It hit his shin a second time. The other 2 were advancing now, making the same sound. He crouched down slowly, one hand in his pack, and came out with a cloth wrap of dried fruit he kept for long days in the forest. He unfolded it and held a piece out flat on his palm. The charging cub stopped. It looked at the fruit. Looked at Theo. Looked at the fruit. It took the piece off his palm with careful delicacy and ate it and looked at his hand for more. "There it is," he said, and broke off another piece. He gave each of them a piece, then scratches behind the ears while they went in for seconds, their small bodies pushing against his hands. The mama bear watched all of this from the ground, her eyes moving between Theo and her cubs, her breathing still labored from the effort of the night. Theo looked at her over the top of the cubs. "I'm going to get you out," he told her, his voice steady. "It's going to take some time and it's going to be loud. I need you to let me work." She watched him. He held her gaze and didn't look away and didn't move until her breathing slowed slightly. Then he picked up his axe. He worked through the night. The mama bear held still while he chopped, tracking every swing, tensing when he got close and settling when he stepped back. When his arms tired, he stopped and sat beside her and gave her water from his flask, and the cubs came and pushed against his legs, and he scratched them and gave them the last of the dried fruit and then went back to work. Between the 2nd and 3rd hour, he found a gash along her left flank where the bark had torn her when the tree fell. Long and deep, already darkening at the edges. He opened his pack and took out a small clay jar of salve, something he mixed himself, a recipe he had been refining for 3 years, and he applied it carefully to the wound, working slowly, talking to her while he did it. "I know," he said quietly when she tensed. "Almost done, you're doing well." She held still. The salve went on, and he wrapped it loosely with a strip of cloth from his pack and tied it off, and she turned her head and sniffed the bandage once and then looked at him. Theo met her eyes firmly, his hand resting briefly on her side. "Good, let's leave it." He went back to chopping. The ridge cat arrived in the 4th hour. Theo heard the undergrowth change first, a specific quality of stillness moving from one direction, the small night sounds cutting out in a line. He lowered his axe and turned. The ridge cat came out of the trees at the clearing's eastern edge. Tawny coat, amber eyes, lean across the shoulders. Its gaze went straight to the cubs. The mama bear's breathing changed immediately. She pulled herself up as high as the tree allowed, and her whole body went rigid, and she made a sound that was nothing like the sound from earlier. This one was pure warning. The ridge cat looked at her, looked at the tree holding her down, looked at the cubs. It took a step forward. Theo moved. He put himself between the ridge cat and the cubs and spread his arms wide and brought his voice up from the bottom of his chest, loud and flat and continuous, filling the clearing. The ridge cat stopped. It looked at him. Theo looked back, arms still out, feet planted. The cat's tail moved in a slow arc. Its eyes did not leave his face, and its weight shifted forward, and it was not going to back down, and Theo knew this and did not move anyway. The mama bear was growling steadily behind him, straining against the tree, unable to do anything but make noise. Then the shadow appeared at the tree line. It came without sound. One moment the trees were dark, and the next something was standing between them that was larger than anything had a right to be, black-furred, massive across the shoulders, its head level with the lower branches. Its pale eyes found the clearing, and it made a sound that was not loud, but moved through the ground and up through the soles of Theo's boots and into his chest. One sound. Then silence. The ridge cat was gone before Theo had fully processed what he was looking at. No hesitation, no second assessment. Just gone, back into the undergrowth and away into the dark. The clearing went very still. The monster stood at the tree line, and its pale eyes moved from the space where the ridge cat had been to Theo. It looked at him. Theo looked back, his arms still spread, his heart loud in his ears. A long moment passed. Something moved in those pale eyes. Nothing Theo had a name for, nothing he could describe later if he tried. An acknowledgement. The specific quality of attention one creature gives another when it has looked and found something it recognizes. The monster held this for a long moment. Then it turned, slowly, and walked back into the dark between the old trees. The shadows closed around it. The forest sounds began to come back in one by one. Theo lowered his arms. He stood in the clearing for a moment, breathing. Behind him, the mama bear had gone quiet. He turned and looked at her. She was watching the tree line where the monster had been, her sides rising and falling. The cubs were pressed against her, very still. Theo looked at the tree line where the monster had been. The forest had already closed back around the space where it stood, the dark between the old trees settling back into ordinary dark. He let out a slow breath. This had happened before. Not here, in other forests, other sections of deep wood, going back further than he could clearly remember. Something large would appear. Something that by every right should have been a threat. And then it would look at him, and something would pass between them that he had no name for, and it would turn and go. He had stopped being surprised by it somewhere around the age of 12. He had never stopped being grateful. He looked up at the old canopy, the first gray light of dawn beginning to find its way through the upper branches. "Thank you," he said quietly, the way he always said it, to the forest, to whatever moved through it, to the thing that had been watching out for him since before he understood that anything was. He picked up his axe and went back to the tree. The tree came free just before dawn. Theo found the right angle on the third lever attempt, the branch sinking deep under the remaining section, and he pushed until his boots slid in the torn earth and pushed harder, and the oak rolled and the mama bear was on her feet before it finished moving. Theo stepped back. She was upright and she turned, and she was very large, and he held still and let her look at him for as long as she needed to. She looked at him for a long time. Then she turned to her cubs and nosed each one over, checking them, and the cubs made high, urgent sounds and pushed back against her, and she pushed them back, and the largest one immediately climbed her foreleg and she pushed it down again with her muzzle. Theo sat down against a nearby tree and watched this, and felt his arms and let his eyes close for just a moment. He woke when something warm pressed against his left side. Then his right. Then something heavier settled across his legs. He did not open his eyes. He sat very still and listened to the clearing and felt the small warm weight of the cubs tucked against him and heard their breathing slow into sleep. He had been alone out here all night. He did not feel alone anymore. Then the mama bear lowered herself to the ground beside him, her broad back against his shoulder, her body warm and enormous and solid. She let out a long, slow breath. The cubs stirred once and settled. Theo sat against the tree with his eyes closed and his axe across his knees, and the bears sleeping around him in the gray early morning, and the forest was quiet, and he did not move. Some days later, Theo woke up early as usual and ate a cold breakfast standing at his window looking out at the tree line. The village was quiet at this hour. The market wouldn't open for 2 hours yet, and the only sounds were the birds starting up in the east and the distant complaint of someone's livestock. He was out the door before the sun cleared the roof. The forest received him the way it always did, the canopy closing overhead, the temperature dropping 5 degrees, the particular quality of silence that wasn't silence at all, but 100 small sounds layered over each other until they became something like quiet. Theo walked the familiar path without looking at his feet, his pack open at his side, already cataloging what the healer had asked for and what he had seen growing where on his last pass-through. The healer's fern came first, thick on the north-facing slopes past the first ridge. He worked the cluster methodically, taking the outer stems and leaving the center shoots, his hands finding the rhythm before his mind caught up with it. A small brown bird landed on his pack while he crouched. It sat there watching him work with its head cocked to one side. "Nothing for you in there," Theo said without looking up. The bird stayed anyway. He found the mushroom cluster the healer had specifically requested at the base of a struck oak, more than he'd hoped for, dense and healthy, the caps wide and unbroken. He filled half his pack carefully, cutting each one at the base, leaving the root structure intact. A deer picked its way into the clearing while he worked and stood 10 feet away, watching him with its ears forward. Not alarmed. Just present, the way the forest creatures were present around Theo, with the easy attention of something that had made its assessment and found no reason to be elsewhere. He finished with the mushrooms and moved on. The first snare held a rabbit. He reset the line with clean hands and moved to the second. Another. 2 was enough. He had mouths to feed tonight, and the rest of the forest had its own accounting to keep. The third snare he found sprung and empty, the ground around it disturbed in a way that told a clear story. He crouched and read the tracks, a fox, moving fast, which meant something had pushed it. He reset the snare and adjusted the position and moved on. 50 meters up the ridge, he found the fox. It was wedged under a root overhang, one foreleg held close to its body, its amber eyes fixed on Theo as he crouched at the edge of the overhang and looked in at it. A gash along the leg, not deep but ragged, the kind that came from catching something sharp at speed. "All right," Theo said, crouching lower to look in at it. "Let me see it." The fox pressed back against the root. He sat down in the leaves in front of the overhang and waited. Not reaching, not speaking, just present. After a few minutes, the fox's ears came forward. After a few more, it had inched close enough that Theo could reach in slowly and run 2 fingers along its back, feeling for damage beyond the leg. Just the leg. He opened his pack and took out the clay jar. The fox flinched at the smell when he opened it, but did not pull away. He applied a thin layer along the gash, working carefully, and the fox held still through it with its eyes fixed on his face. "There," Theo said, sitting back on his heels. "Give it 2 days." He closed the jar and sat back. The fox looked at him for a moment longer, then turned and picked its way deeper under the root and curled up. Done with him. Theo stood and brushed leaves off his trousers and kept moving. The blocked waterway he found mid-morning. A section of the creek that ran along the eastern edge of his range had backed up behind a tangle of debris, branches, a section of root ball, soil packed in around it by the recent rain until the water had nowhere to go and had started spreading sideways into the root systems of the old trees on the bank. He stood at the edge of it and looked at the damage and calculated the work. He took off his pack and rolled up his sleeves. It took the better part of an hour. The root ball was the main obstacle, and it had wedged itself with the particular stubbornness of something that had not been asked to move. He worked it from 3 angles with a pry bar he kept for exactly this kind of problem, pulling branches free with his hands when the bar couldn't reach, the cold water running up his arms to the elbow. 2 small creatures he didn't immediately recognize sat on the bank watching the whole operation with great interest. One of them kept moving slightly closer whenever Theo's back was turned, retreating when he looked at it. "I see you," he said, without turning around. It froze. When the root ball finally gave and the water ran clear and fast through the gap he had opened, Theo sat back on the bank and listened to it. He was tired and cold to the elbow and quietly pleased in the way he always was when the forest was working correctly again. The two creatures on the bank watched the water for a moment. Then one of them climbed onto Theo's boot and stood there. He looked down at it. It looked up at him. "Fine," he said, and looked back at the water. He found the golden apple tree at midday. It grew at the edge of a clearing where a gap in the canopy let real light through, and he had been checking it on his rounds for 2 weeks, waiting for the right moment. The fruit hung heavy on the lower branches now, the skin that deep warm gold that meant it was ready. He picked the largest one. 3 deer had drifted into the clearing while he stood there, drawn by whatever it was the tree put into the air when the fruit was ripe. A pair of birds had appeared in the branches above. The 2 small creatures from the waterway had apparently followed him the entire way and were now sitting at his feet looking up at the apple with focused attention. Theo looked at the assembled company. He pulled out his knife and cut the apple into sections on his palm, distributing pieces to the deer and the birds and the 2 small creatures at his feet, keeping the last piece for himself. He sat down with his back against the tree and put it in his mouth and chewed slowly. The warmth spread from the back of his throat through his chest and down into his arms. He closed his eyes. The clearing was quiet around him. The water ran somewhere to the east where he had cleared it. The light came through the canopy gap and fell warm on his face. He sat there for a while. He was working his way back through the mid-forest, late afternoon light coming down at a low angle through the old trees, when he heard it. The sound came from the northeast, sharp impacts, something heavy hitting the ground, a quality of disturbance in the forest noise that he knew from long experience meant something large was fighting, something else large. The birds in that direction had gone up. The small animals had gone quiet. He had made this mistake once, when he was maybe 14. Followed the sounds, pushed through the undergrowth, and came out into a clearing 30 feet from an ancient in full armor, standing over a creature twice the size of the mama bear. The ancient had looked at him. That was all. Just looked. Theo had backed out very slowly and had not done it again. He gave the sounds a wide berth, adjusting his route south, moving quietly until the noise of the fight faded behind him. He had learned what was his work and what wasn't. The light was going golden low through the canopy when Theo turned back toward the village. His pack was full, the day's harvest, the healer's order, 2 rabbits wrapped in cloth. A good day. The kind where the forest felt like it was working with him. The village hit him the way it always did when he came back from the deep wood, suddenly loud, suddenly close, the sounds of 23 people going about their evening all arriving at once. Cooking smells. A child shouting somewhere on the east side. The Forge brothers calling to each other across the lane in the easy shorthand of people who had known each other since birth. He dropped his pack at the healer's door and unloaded today's harvest onto her table. She looked it over carefully, checking each bundle. "Good," the healer said, picking up a bundle to observe. "Same time next week." Theo leaned against the doorframe. "The fern on the north slope is coming in thicker than usual. I can bring extra if you need it for the winter stores." She looked up at him. Not unkind. Just uncertain. Still deciding what to make of the man who walked into the deep forest every morning and walked back out every evening, which was not something anyone did. Not here. Not anywhere. The deep forest was ancient territory, the domain of beings that had walked this land for centuries before humans built their first wall. Creatures that lived in the dark between those old trees were not creatures that left survivors. Everyone knew this. Theo had been going there for years. And still, every week she looked at him the same way, like she was waiting for the day he stopped coming back. "I'll think on it," the healer replied, and went back to her work. "Sure," Theo replied. "See you next week." Stepped back out into the lane. A group of children were chasing each other near the well, shrieking. He watched them for a moment, then reached into his pack and pulled out a cloth with the last of the dried fruit, pieces he had not distributed in the forest that afternoon. "Hey," he said, crouching down as one of the children ran past. "Want some?" The child stopped. Looked at Theo. Looked at the fruit. Looked back at Theo with the frank assessment only small children manage. A woman appeared at the child's shoulder almost immediately. She smiled at Theo, a careful smile. "That's very kind," the woman said, pulling the child gently back, "but it's nearly dinner." "Next time then," Theo said. "Next time," the woman said, already turning away. He folded the cloth back up and got to his feet. He stood there a moment, watching the villagers go about their evening. They nodded to him politely. He nodded back. By the time he reached his house at the edge of the village, the quiet had settled in like any other night. That was the thing about it. It always felt like any other night. It never got easier, and it never got worse. It was just the shape of his life. Across the forest, at the boundary, the creature was fast. That was the thing about the enraged ones. They were always faster than their size suggested, faster than they had any right to be, as though whatever had broken loose inside them had burned away everything except the drive to move and destroy. This one had come out of the deep forest 3 hours ago at a dead run toward the boundary, and Veyra's party had intercepted it half a mile in, and what should have been a clean interception had turned into something considerably less clean because it had changed direction twice in ways that a creature this size simply should not have been able to manage. Solon had a deep gash along his left arm. Mirren was favoring her right side where the creature had caught her with a glancing blow that had cracked something, ribs, maybe 2. Veyra had a gouge across her left shoulder plate deep enough that the metal had bent inward and was pressing against the flesh beneath. Veyra felt none of it. She felt the ground under her boots and the weight of the sword in her hand and the creature's next movement before it made it, the slight shift in the hindquarters, the weight transfer that telegraphed the lunge. She had been doing this for 3 centuries. The enraged ones were dangerous, but they were not subtle. It lunged. She stepped left, dropped her weight, drove the sword up and forward with both hands behind it into the gap beneath the creature's jaw where the armor of bone gave way to softer tissue. The blade went in clean and deep, and she held it there while the creature's momentum carried it forward and down, and then it was still. The forest went quiet around them. Veyra straightened. Veyra was tall, silver-white hair pulled back tight against her head, her armor dark gray and close-fitted from shoulder to boot. Her face was straight-featured and still, a clean jaw, a narrow mouth, dark brows. Her eyes were pale amber, the color of old honey held up to light. She pulled the sword free and cleaned it on the ground the way she always did and sheathed it. Her left shoulder ached where the bent plate pressed in. She would deal with it later. Mirren appeared at her right, one arm held close to her side, breathing carefully. Mirren had dark hair cut to the jaw and a face that was soft at the edges, full mouth, dark eyes, the kind of features that suggested warmth without confirming it. Solon appeared at Veyra's left, his sleeve dark and wet from the elbow down. Solon was half a head taller than either of them, and twice as wide across the chest, his brown hair cropped short, his jaw square, and his expression the particular blank of someone who had made peace with being the largest person in every room a very long time ago. They looked at the creature on the ground, and then at each other, and then at Veyra. Nobody said anything. There was nothing to say. This was the work. Veyra turned toward the tree line and started walking. They moved through the forest in the usual formation, Veyra ahead, Mirren and Solon flanking, though the usual formation was somewhat compromised by the fact that Mirren was breathing in the specific shallow, careful way that meant cracked ribs, and Solon was bleeding steadily through the makeshift wrap he had applied to his arm without breaking stride or mentioning it. The forest settled around them as they walked. The birds came back first, then the smaller sounds, the forest reassembling itself after the disturbance, the way it always did, with the patient efficiency of something that had absorbed worse and continued. "I need a vacation," Solon complained, pressing his makeshift wrap tighter against his arm. "No," denied Veyra, not breaking stride. "My arm is currently open," Solon mentioned, as if filing a report on his own injury. Veyra kept her eyes forward. "It has been open before." "Not this open," Solon conceded, and left it there. Mirren made a sound that might have been a suppressed laugh and then stopped making it abruptly because laughing with cracked ribs was its own problem. They walked. The afternoon light was coming down at a low angle through the canopy, the shadows lengthening, the temperature dropping the way it did in the deep forest when the day began its turn toward evening. Veyra felt the ache in her shoulder settling into something more insistent as the focus of the fight left her body and the ordinary awareness of damage returned. She would deal with it at her usual place at the boundary. The path curved along the eastern creek and Veyra noticed it before anyone said anything. the water running clear and fast where it had been backed up and spreading for the past 2 weeks, the debris gone, the banks settling back to their proper lines. Mirhen came up beside her. "The human," she said. "I saw him this morning past the second ridge. He came directly to it and spent most of the morning clearing it." Veyra's eyes remained on the tree line ahead. How did he know it was blocked? "I don't know," Mirren's voice carrying a hint of frown. "He came directly to it. He didn't search." Solon glanced over at Mirren. The creatures were with him again? "Following him since the eastern ridge," Mirren reported, her tone careful. "Some wounded, he treated them." "He was also in the northern section last week," Solon added, his voice lower now. "Near the old spring. 2 of the deep forest predators changed course around him. He didn't move, they changed course." Veyra kept her eyes on the tree line ahead. She had not commented on the human since the first time Mirren had mentioned the sightings, 3 months ago. A human who walks the deep forest, who the large predators avoid, who moves through the old growth like he belongs there. She had not commented then, and she had not commented since. She wanted to ask how. She did not ask. Veyra settled at her usual place at the boundary, her back against the wide pale root, and looked out at the valley below. 23 people. 6 families. The market had closed. She could tell by the way the eastern lane emptied, the last 2 stalls folding in the order they always folded. The elder's lamp came on first, the way it always did, the way his father's had before him and his grandmother's before that. The children by the pond were still outside. They were always outside too late. Their mother would call them in shortly. She had been assigned this posting 260 years ago. The youngest of the bloodline, the least senior, given the boundary station that nobody withstanding wanted, the furthest from the family seat, the hardest posting, the one with no political advantage and no prestige and nothing to recommend it except that it mattered. She had arrived at this route 260 years ago and looked out at a valley that held 11 people and 4 buildings, and she had sat down and done her work. The valley had grown. The families had come and gone and come again, children becoming elders, becoming names she no longer had faces for, the village cycling through its generations the way the forest cycled through its seasons. She had not lost a single one of them. She intended to keep it that way. Something was shifting in the deep forest. The enraged ones had been coming faster and harder for 3 months, faster than the previous pattern, changing direction in ways that cost her party damage they should not have taken. She had her theories about what drove the enragement, had been building them for 20 years, and none of them were complete. The creatures were not simply aggressive. Something broke in them. She wanted to understand what broke, and whether it could be prevented, because killing them one by one at the boundary was not a solution, it was a delay. The elder's lamp burned steady in the window. The children ran inside when their mother called. The Forge brothers walked the north path home, their silhouettes familiar against the last gray light. Veyra watched over her village and did not hear the footsteps on the path until they were close. The detour had taken him further east than he usually went, skirting wide around the sounds of the fight he had heard earlier, and by the time the forest thinned toward the boundary, the path he was on was one he rarely used. The evening light came through the canopy gap at a low angle, the valley below briefly visible, and Theo was adjusting his pack for the walk home when he saw her. She was sitting at the boundary with her back against a wide pale root, legs extended, looking out at the valley. Silver-white hair pulled back. Dark gray armor, one shoulder plate gouged and bent inward. Theo stopped. The evening was cold. The temperature had dropped sharply in the last hour, the way it did this close to the boundary when the light went, and she was sitting completely still in it. Not the stillness of comfort. She was sitting completely still in it, her damaged shoulder held at an angle that kept the bent plate from pressing in. He looked at the bent shoulder plate, at the way she held that side. He unslung his coat. It was heavy wool, dark green, warm from a full day of wearing. He stepped forward and placed it over her shoulders. She did not move. Her amber eyes tracked him, and his breath stopped for a half-second. "Keep it," Theo said, already turning back down the path. "I'm 5 minutes from a fire." He turned and started back down the path. He did not look back. The ancients did not respond. He did not look back. He walked, thinking about whether he had enough bread for the morning and whether the fox's leg would hold if it tried to move too soon. He had taken maybe 20 steps when he heard it. It's warm, Veyra said, almost to herself. Thank you, Veyra added, even quieter. His head turned before he had finished processing what he heard. 2 words. Clearly not meant for him. He stood on the path and did not move. Nobody had ever thanked him before. Not the village. Not the forest. Nobody. He wanted to laugh. He wanted to sit down on the path. He did neither. He stood very still and let it land. She was sitting very still, looking at a point somewhere to the left of him, jaw set, the coat around her shoulders. Herser, behind her, Solon and Mirren had gone completely motionless. You weren't supposed to hear that, she said, each word placed carefully. I wasn't. A pause. I don't know why I said that. Theo turned around fully. He looked at her. At the amber eyes fixed on a point past his shoulder. At the rigid set of her shoulders and the tight line of her jaw, she was mortified. Every part of her was working to pretend the last 10 seconds had not happened. He smiled. I'm Theo, he said. Nice to meet you. Veyra stood up. She was moving before the intention had fully resolved itself, already into the tree line, the coat still on her shoulders. Solon followed immediately. Mirren passed the boundary last, her dark eyes finding Theo's face for one moment, and then the forest closed around all 3 of them and the path was empty. Theo stood at the boundary. He looked at the space between the trees where they had gone. He turned and walked toward the village. He made it 10 steps. He stopped. He stood on the path with one hand over his mouth, grinning so wide it hurt. He walked. It happened again. He stopped. Breathed. Kept walking. The village lights were coming on ahead of him in the early evening dark. An ancient had spoken to him. By accident. He had been waiting his entire life for that. On the other side of the boundary, Veyra's party had barely cleared the boundary tree line when Mirren broke the silence. So, it looks like you are keeping the coat, Mirren said, watching Veyra's hands on the coat's lapels. Veyra stopped walking. She turned around. Her eyes were bright, her cheeks flushed, and she had the coat open at the front with both hands on the lapels, presenting it like evidence in a trial she had already won. Do you see this? Veyra said, unable to keep the excitement out of her voice. Do you see what has happened tonight? Mirren looked at Solon. Solon looked at Mirren. Both of them looked at Veyra. My subjects have given me an offering, Veyra announced, pressing both hands to the front of the coat. Your what now? Mirren asked, blinking. The village, Veyra said, dropping the lapels and standing straight. My village. 6 families, 23 people. I have protected them for 260 years, and tonight one of them came forward and presented me with a gift from his own back. She looked down at the coat, smoothed the front of it with both hands, and looked back up. It is warm, Veyra said. Mirren and Solon looked at each other. Something passed between them that required no words and lasted approximately 1 second. Your Highness, Mirren said carefully, the human, the one who gave you the coat, he is the one they call the Odd One, the one who has been talking to every ancient he encounters in the deep forest. I am aware, Veyra said, unbothered. So he talks to everyone, Mirren said, keeping her voice neutral. He does, Veyra said. She clasped her hands behind her back and tilted her head and looked at Mirren with the patient expression of someone waiting for a slower student to catch up. But how many times has he given his coat to the others, Mirren? In 3 months of encounters, any of them, do you know? Mirren opened her mouth. Closed it. None, Mirren said, her mouth still open. Precisely, Veyra said, her eyes lighting up. She turned and started walking again, both hands smoothing the front of the coat. She was happy. She could not remember the last time she had been simply, uncomplicated happy. Behind her, Solon pressed his lips together very hard and looked up at the canopy. I have been thinking about this, Veyra said, walking. For 260 years. They are my village. I have kept them safe through every season, every generation, every enraged creature that has come through that forest, and tonight one of them walked up and gave me his coat. She paused for half a step. I am their protector, and now they know it, Veyra said. Solon looked at Mirren. Mirren looked at Solon. Solon's shoulders moved once, silently. Mirren turned her face away toward the trees and breathed very carefully through her cracked ribs, which was the only thing stopping her from continuing the conversation. They walked. Veyra's residence sat closest to the tree line at the edge of the ancient city, modest and low, the door facing the forest the way she had always preferred it. "Can I have the coat?" Solon said reasonably. "I'm cold." "Certainly not," Veyra said, not breaking stride. "I have also defended the village for 260 years, Solon argued, calmly and without shame. "So have I," Mirren added, unable to keep the amusement out of her voice. "Hush," said Veyra, and pushed the door open and went inside with a lightness in her step that neither Mirren nor Solon had seen in a very long time, and both of them saw it, and neither of them said a word. Inside, the fire in the main room had burned down to embers. Veyra added 2 logs, dropped into the chair closest to the hearth, and reached back to work the buckles on her damaged shoulder plate with one hand. She pulled it free and dropped it onto the workbench with a clank. The flesh beneath was bruised dark, and the gash from the bent metal was crusted and angry at the edges. And there, running from her collarbone up to her jaw, was the scar, pale and raised, the color of old ice, glowing faintly the way it always did after a hard fight. The way it had looked for 300 years. Solon lowered himself into the chair across from Veyra with the careful economy of someone whose body had taken significant damage and was not interested in taking more. His eyes moved to the scar, then to the fire. Mirren stood in the doorway of her quarters for a moment, looking at Veyra's jaw. She had looked at that scar every day for 260 years. She had stopped saying anything about it a long time ago. 300 years ago, Veyra had been the one sent into the eastern forest when the cursed creature came through the boundary, not because she was the most capable, but because she was the youngest and the most expendable, and the eldest siblings had agreed among themselves that the posting was hers. She had killed the creature. She had also taken its curse directly across the face and collarbone in the process, a wound that the family's finest healers had worked on for a decade before concluding, quietly and without ceremony, that it would not close. A cursed scar on the youngest princess meant she could not be placed in a formal alliance. It could not be used in the political arrangements that the ruling bloodline depended on. So Veyra's family had given her the boundary posting instead, the edge of the forest, the enraged monsters, the village of 23 people that nobody else wanted to watch, and the family had gone on without her, and the scar had stayed, and 3 centuries had passed. Mirren sat down at her desk in the corner. She took out the incident report form, set it flat, uncapped her pen, and began filling in the fields. Date. Location. Nature of contact. She reached the category field. She stopped. Her pen hovered over the page. She read through the 17 available categories slowly, her dark eyes moving down the list, her jaw set. Then she read through them again. She pressed 2 fingers to her left temple and held them there. "Your brother is going to throw a fit over this," Mirren said, setting her pen down. Veyra had her feet tucked up under her in the chair, the coat still around her shoulders, her chin resting in one hand. She looked across at Mirren with one eyebrow raised. "Vaughn? Why would he care?" Veyra said. "The entire city will care," Mirren said, still looking at the form. Veyra looked back at the fire. "About my coat," Veyra said. Mirren looked up. "About you talking to the human," Mirren said, holding her gaze. Veyra's chin came up from her hand. She looked at the fire. Then, down at the coat. She smoothed the front of it with one palm, slowly. She had been so happy about the coat that she had forgotten entirely about the rest of it, the politics, the implications, what Vaughn would say. The happiness and the worry arrived at the same time, and she did not know what to do with either of them. "I got so excited I forgot entirely about that," Veyra admitted, the words coming out quieter than she intended. The pen in Mirren's hand made a small sound against the desk as she set it down. Solon turned his head from the ceiling to look at Veyra. Then at Mirren. Then back at the ceiling. "You are not just anyone," Mirren said, her hands flat on the desk now. "You are ruling blood. Vaughn's house leads the ancients. Every faction is watching everything your family does. If word gets out that you spoke to a human at the boundary, your brothers will not stay silent." "No, they won't," Veyra said, with a short exhale that was almost a laugh. Mirren picked up the pen again and tapped it twice against the desk. "So what do we do?" Mirren asked. Veyra turned her head and looked at the damaged shoulder plate on the workbench. The metal was gouged through in 2 places, the surface battered from 260 years of this exact work at this exact posting. She looked at it for a moment. "When was the last time Vaughn sent anyone to collect our reports?" Veyra said, not looking away from the workbench. Mirhen's pen stopped tapping. "Never," Mirren said. "Precisely," Veyra said, and stood up and rolled her injured shoulder and winced and straightened and crossed the room. At the door to her quarters she stopped, lifted the coat from her shoulders, held it in both hands for a moment, and took it with her. The door closed behind her. Mirhen sat looking at the blank category field. She picked up her pen. She put it down. She folded the report, wrote her name across the seal, and placed it in the bottom drawer beneath 2 centuries of other paperwork. Solon watched the fire. "The coat is still on," Solon observed, still watching the fire. "I know," Mirren said without looking up. "I would still very much like to have the coat," Solon mentioned after a moment. Mirren looked up at the fire roaring in the hearth and let out a long, slow breath. "I know," Mirren said quietly. The next evening, Theo came along the eastern path, his pack lighter from the day's work. He rounded the curve, and Veyra was at her usual place, sitting against the wide, pale root, legs extended, looking out at the valley. She heard his boots on the path and had already turned her head by the time he came around the curve. "Hello, Theo," Veyra said. Theo stopped walking. He smiled wide, the kind that took over his whole face. She had remembered his name. She had said it first. "Hello there," Theo replied, trying to contain his excitement. "Do you have a name?" "Veyra," she replied, watching him. "Veyra," Theo repeated carefully, like he was making sure he had it right. Behind Veyra, Mirren stood at the edge of the tree line, arms folded, watching both of them with quiet concern. A pause settled between Theo and Veyra. Neither of them filled it. "You are wearing a different coat today," Veyra noted, her eyes moving to his coat, trying to make it sound like an observation and not a question. "Yes," Theo said, entirely unbothered. "Today was as cold as yesterday." Veyra straightened against the root. She smoothed the front of her armor with both hands and lifted her chin. "Are you here to offer me your coat again?" Veyra asked. Theo looked at her, at the lifted chin, the smoothed armor, the very deliberate posture of someone making room for a coat, and pressed his mouth together. "This is the only one I have left," Theo said, trying to keep his face straight. "Do ancients not have coats? I could ask our village elder to make you some. He made me 3 last winter." Theo saw the disappointment in Veyra's eyes. "That won't be necessary," Veyra said, the disappointment leaving her voice a beat too late. Theo watched her for a moment. Then he reached into his pack and pulled out a folded cloth. He opened it. Inside, cut into neat pieces, the golden apple fruit, the skin deep warm gold, the smell coming off it immediately, sweet and rich, and something underneath that no ordinary fruit carried. "It's not much," Theo said, unfolding the cloth carefully, "but it's my favorite thing I find in the forest." Veyra looked at the fruit. The color caught the last of the evening light. The smell reached her, and she sat forward against the root. Behind her, Mirren unfolded her arms and stepped forward. Veyra reached out and picked up a piece. She turned it over, brought it close, breathed it in. "Veyra," Mirren said, stepping closer, her hand coming up. Veyra put the fruit in her mouth. Mirren stopped dead. Veyra chewed. Once. Twice. She went still. Her amber eyes went wide and she looked at Theo with every wall down. Theo looked back at her. He forgot, briefly, what he had been about to say next. "What is this?" Veyra asked, the words out before she could stop them. "Golden apple," Theo said, already moving to break off another piece for her. "I find them in the deep forest. The animals follow me when I am carrying it, which gets inconvenient on the longer routes." "This is the most delicious thing I have tasted in years," Veyra said, already reaching for more. Theo grinned, watching her reaction. "Yeah, it's pretty good." Veyra stopped, raising one eyebrow. She looked at him with flat amber eyes. "Pretty good?" "Really good," Theo corrected quickly. "It is exceptional," Veyra said, and took 2 more pieces. From the tree line, Solon's voice came low. "She ate the human's food," Solon said. Mirren stood with her hand still half raised and said nothing. Her liege had just eaten unidentified food from a human's cloth bag, and there was nothing Mirren could do about it because it had already happened. "I would also like to try the snack," Solon said. Nobody answered him. On the path, a small brown creature had crept forward and placed both its front feet on Theo's boot, its eyes fixed on the cloth. Theo glanced down, broke off a small piece, and held it out. The creature took it and sat back on its haunches. Veyra watched this with a piece of fruit halfway to her mouth. Then she put it in her mouth. "Veyra!" Mirren called out to her. "Hush," said Veyra, and held her hand out toward Theo for more, her eyes fixed on the cloth. The days settled into a pattern. Theo took the eastern path every evening. Veyra was at the wide pale route when he arrived. He brought the golden apple fruit when he found it. When he did not find it, he brought other things: dried berries from the high ridge, honeycomb wrapped in cloth, once a small wheel of hard cheese from the village market that Veyra examined for a long time before eating the entire thing in 4 bites and saying nothing. He stayed longer each time. She let him. Mirren stood watch at the tree line. She noticed that Veyra had stopped watching the valley. Her eyes went to the curve in the path now, from the moment she arrived until Theo came around it. When he did, her shoulders dropped half an inch. Mirren said nothing. Solon said nothing. They were good at this. One evening, Theo came around the curve faster than usual, his pack bouncing on his back. "Veyra," he called out, breathing hard, "can you come with me?" Veyra was already on her feet. "Are you all right?" she asked. "Yes, I'm fine," Theo said. "I need you to follow me, quickly." She followed. Mirren and Solon fell in behind her, hands on their weapons. Theo moved into the forest, and Veyra matched his pace, watching him. He ducked under branches without slowing, stepped over roots without looking down, changed direction twice without hesitating. He moved through the deep wood the way she moved through it, reading the terrain without thinking about it, his body making the adjustments before his mind caught up. She watched him clear a low branch with a clean sidestep and felt something she had not expected to feel. Not concern. Not surprise. Recognition. She had 260 years in this forest. He had much less. It was impressive. Theo slowed as they approached a small clearing and held up his fist to signal everyone to stop. Veyra stopped. Mirren and Solon froze behind her, weapons half drawn. Then Theo stepped into the clearing. 5 massive shapes detonated out of the tree line directly at him. Dark gray, shoulder height, moving fast. Veyra's sword was out before the first one reached him. Theo went down under all 5 of them at once. Veyra crossed the clearing in 3 strides, sword raised, and stopped. The sounds coming from the pile were not the sounds of an attack. They were high and urgent and unmistakably joyful. A tail the size of a small branch was wagging so hard it was hitting 2 of the other wolves. One of them had its entire face buried in Theo's neck. Another was sitting on his legs. "Hello," Theo said from somewhere underneath them, his voice muffled. "Yes, I missed you too, all of you. Yes, all of you, but you need to give me space. I can't breathe." Veyra lowered her sword. Mirren appeared at her shoulder, blade still out, looking at the pile. Solon appeared on her other side. Nobody said anything. Theo extracted himself 1 wolf at a time, each one immediately circling back for more. He stood up covered in fur, breathing hard, and pointed to each of them in turn. "Dirt, thief, stone, river, and the one currently trying to eat my pack is Puddle," he said, looking at Veyra. "Wolf cubs from last winter, they've grown." At the edge of the clearing, half hidden behind a fallen trunk, the mother lay watching. She was enormous, bigger than any wolf Veyra had encountered on the boundary. Her left foreleg was extended, a long scar running from shoulder to paw, healed clean. She watched Theo with her head resting on her front legs, completely still, completely calm. "I found her bleeding near the eastern creek," Theo said, following Veyra's gaze. "She would not let me close for 4 days. I just kept coming back." He shrugged. "Somebody had to feed her cubs," Theo said. Veyra looked at the mother wolf. At the scar. At the 5 cubs now pressing against Theo's legs while he absently scratched 2 of them at once. She had patrolled this forest for 260 years. She had ended the enraged ones at the boundary, every dark cycle, every time, because that was the work and the work had to be done. But she had never once done what Theo had done. She had never sat 4 days in the cold waiting for a wounded animal to trust her. She had never thought to. The forest creatures were not hers to tend. They were hers to watch, and sometimes hers to end, and she had kept that distance because it was the sensible distance to keep. Looking at the mother wolf watching Theo, the complete absence of fear in those pale eyes, Veyra understood for the first time what that distance had cost her. "Would you like to meet them?" Theo asked. Veyra looked at him. Then at the cubs. The largest one, Dirt, with the dark smudge across its muzzle, had turned and was looking at her with its head tilted, ears forward. She crouched down and held out her hand. Dirt sniffed it, then stepped forward. Then pressed its enormous head against her palm and stood there. Veyra scratched behind its ears. The cub's back leg started moving on its own. Then the second one came over. Then the third. And before she had fully registered what was happening, Veyra was sitting on the ground of the deep forest with 4 wolf cubs pressed against her from every direction, their warm weight leaning in, and she was laughing, actually laughing, surprised out of it, while Theo watched with his hands in his pockets and said nothing at all. Behind them, Mir had sheathed her blade. She watched Veyra for a moment. "What is our protocol here?" she said quietly. Solon looked at the mother wolf in the shadows. "That animal is a first-class threat. Standard engagement requires 6 trained soldiers minimum," Solon said. "We have 3, Mirn said. 2, they have already taken our princess," Solon said. They watched Veyra scratch 2 cubs simultaneously, while a third attempted to climb into her lap. "She looks happy," Mirren said. "She does," Solon agreed. "We are going to die out here, aren't we?" Mirhen asked. "Most likely," Solon agreed. That evening, Veyra told Theo that the animals following him through the forest could enrage. Theo nodded. "I know," he said, like it was something he had already made his peace with. "When the enraged ones reach the boundary, I have no choice but to end them," Veyra said, watching him carefully. "I know that too," Theo said, his voice the same as before. "You are not upset by this?" Veyra asked, keeping her voice even. "They are not themselves when it happens," Theo said, keeping his voice steady. "I have seen it from inside the forest. I know what it looks like when the dark cycle is building. The animals change before the enragement. The forest gets heavy." He paused. "I try to help before it gets that far. Clear what is blocking, move what is sick, give the forest what it needs to push through. Sometimes it works, sometimes it doesn't," Theo said. Herd seed. Veyra looked at him for a long time. 260 years. She had held this boundary through every dark cycle the forest had produced in 260 years. She had ended what came through and filed her reports and stood watch alone and never spoken to anyone who knew what she was fighting for. "I have been ending them at the boundary for 260 years, Veyra said, her voice quiet now. "Every cycle, every time, I never thought about what was happening on the other side of it." Theo looked at her. "I never thought it was you on the other side," he said. They sat with that, the strange weight of 2 people who had been keeping the same forest alive from opposite sides of it, alone, for years, and had not known until now. The valley below went dark. The village fires came on one by one, and neither of them moved. Mirn watched Veyra's face. Cal, she had seen Veyra after battles. She had seen her after losses. She had seen her standing at this boundary in the rain for 2 centuries. Mirhen recognized what was on her face now. She had seen Veyra after battles and losses and 2 centuries of standing watch in the rain. She had never once seen her look the way she looked right now. It was relief. Some weeks later, the sound came from the northeast, steel on bone, the birds already gone from the tree line in that direction, the forest holding its breath the way it did when something was wrong. Theo stood at the empty boundary route and listened. Veyra had not come. He knew what the sound was. He had spent years learning to route around it, to give it wide berth, to stay on his side of the line the ancients drew between their work and his. He knew this. He picked up his pack and walked toward the sound anyway. The smell hit him first, blood and something underneath it, the specific wrongness that meant enragement. He pushed through the undergrowth and came out at the edge of a wide clearing and went completely still. The creature was enormous. It moved in fast, unpredictable bursts, its weight shifting in ways that made no sense for something that size. Mirhen was on its left, Solen on its right, both of them working to keep it contained. Veyra was directly in front of it, her armor torn across one shoulder, her feet set, watching for the opening. Theo remembered immediately why humans did not do this work. Then the creature's head swung toward him. One pale eye found him through the undergrowth. The creature went still for half a second, registering him, assessing, and then it turned fully, abandoning Veyra and orienting on Theo instead. It lunged. Theo couldn't move because his legs had stopped working. Veyra crossed the clearing in 4 strides and drove her sword through the back of its neck before it closed the distance. The creature dropped. The ground shook once. Then the clearing went quiet, and the only sounds were the forest coming back and Theo's own heartbeat very loud in his ears. Veyra pulled her sword free and turned to Theo. He had never seen her face look like that before. Not the controlled stillness of the boundary route. Not the warmth of the wolf cubs. Something much simpler and much more frightening. She was furious, and she was walking directly at him, and she had a sword in her hand. An hour passed. Theo was still on his knees. His expression had been attentive and apologetic for the entire hour and showed no signs of changing. The clearing around them had gone from late afternoon gold to early evening gray. Somewhere behind Veyra, Mirren was rewrapping Solan's arm. Enraged ones are nothing like their regular selves, Veyra said, her voice level and precise. It had been level and precise for the entire hour, which Theo had learned was considerably more serious than shouting. Their speed alone makes them unpredictable. Their strength increases threefold. They register no pain. You saw what it did to Solan's armor, Veyra continued. She paused. You saw what it did to mine, Veyra said. Another pause. And you, with no armor, no weapon, no training, walked directly into the path of one because you were curious, Veyra said. But I wasn't curious, Theo said. Then why did you come here, Theo? Veyra asked, her voice losing some of its precision. Theo looked at the ground in front of his knees. You did not come to the root, he said. The forest sounded wrong. I knew it was probably nothing. I came anyway. Veyra was quiet for a moment. That does not make it less dangerous, she said. Her voice shifted slightly, the precision still there but a bit softer. How about you? Are you all right? Theo asked, his eyes on the right shoulder armor which looked badly damaged. That is not the relevant question right now, Veyra said. It is to me, Theo challenged, looking up at her. It has been the relevant question for the last hour and you have not answered it once. Veyra's chin came up. I am fine, Veyra refuted, looking down at him. Your right shoulder does not look fine at all, Theo pointed out. Is fine, Veyra stomped her feet and turned her head to the side. You have been standing at an angle since you sheathed your sword, Theo said. You are hiding it from me. I stand however I like, Veyra said, shifting her body, but both Theo and Veyra noticed she said it a half-second too late. Veyra, Theo called out softly, looking directly at her eyes. It is a minor tear, she said, her voice clipped now, the precision back in full. The armor took the impact. The wound beneath it is superficial and does not require your attention or your concern or any further discussion. Theo looked at her for a long moment. Then he said, quietly and without any particular emphasis, please be more careful next time. Veyra stared at him. The tips of her ears went pink. Do not turn this around on me. This is not about me, Veyra said. And in that exact moment, a sound came from somewhere in the region of Veyra's stomach. Low. Extended. Deep sound of her stomach growling. The clearing went completely silent. Veyra's ears went from pink to red. Theo reached into his pack without a word, pulled out the fruit cloth, and held it out to her with the expression of a man who understood that this was not the moment for commentary. Veyra snatched it out of his hand. She turned and walked toward the tree line with her back very straight and her ears still red and the fruit cloth pressed against her chest. We are not finished, she announced without turning around. I know, Theo said. Veyra walked into the trees. Mirren and Solan fell in behind her without a word. Theo sat back on his heels in the empty clearing. The forest had gone quiet around him, the evening sounds coming back one by one. He looked at the space between the trees where Veyra had disappeared. He was still smiling when he picked up his pack and headed home. A few days later, the rain had been coming down since mid-morning, not hard, just steady, the kind that made the forest smell like wet bark and turned the air thick and close. Theo had his shirt sleeves rolled to the elbow, working a section of root that had pushed up through the ground near the tree line and was threatening to split the path. Physical work, the kind that required leverage more than speed. His shirt was soaked through and had been for an hour. Veyra had finished patrol early. Her armor was stacked against the pale root, all of it, for once the full set laid out to let the joints breathe in the damp air. She was sitting on the root in her underlayer, a fitted low-cut white shirt, her silver hair loose and damp against her neck. A scar ran from her collarbone up to her jaw in plain view, pale against her silver-white skin. She was reading a report. Theo glanced over. He looked back at his work. He glanced over again. Veyra turned a page without looking up. Theo pushed the pry bar deeper under the root and leaned his weight into it and glanced over again. "You can ask," Veyra said, still looking at her report. Theo straightened up. "Ask what?" he said. "Whatever it is you keep looking at," she said. Veyra set the report down on her knee. She looked at him directly, her chin level, her voice even. "Does my scar make you uncomfortable?" Veyra asked. Theo blinked. He looked at the scar. Then back at her face. Then, briefly, at her collarbone. Then lower. Then back to her face, too quickly. "No," his voice cracked. Veyra looked at him for a moment. Her eyes tracked exactly where his had gone. Her expression did not change, but the tips of her ears went slightly pink. "I see," she said. "I was not," Theo started. "It is fine," Veyra said, and picked a report back up. Her ears were still pink. She read the same line 3 times without taking any of it in. Theo turned back to his root and put his weight on the pry bar and said nothing, which was the correct decision. After a moment, Veyra set the report down again. "I got it 300 years ago," she said. "The scar, in case you were wondering." Theo straightened up and looked at her. He did not say anything. He waited. "There was a creature," Veyra said, "Eastern Forest, 300 years ago. I killed it. The scar was the cost." She touched the line of it briefly with 2 fingers, from collarbone to jaw, then dropped her hand. "The healers worked on it for a decade, a cursed wound. It would not close," Veyra said. She looked at the valley. "I have had it for 300 years. I am used to it, but I am aware of it every day, and I am aware when other people see it," Veyra said. She said it plainly, not asking for anything, just stating the fact. Theo set his pry bar against the tree. He reached down and pulled his wet shirt off over his head and held out his arm. "This one," he said, pointing to a thin white line running across his forearm, "was a rabbit. I was trying to reset its leg and it disagreed." He turned his arm over. "This one I got from a branch that came back faster than I expected. And this," he pointed to a small round scar near his shoulder, "was one of the wolf cubs, Stone. He thought I was going to hurt his mother. He was wrong, but I understood his reasoning." Veyra looked at his arms. Then at the rest of him, which was covered in small marks of various sizes and ages, a record of years of work written directly onto his skin. "You have a great many of them," she said. "I do," Theo agreed. He looked at her scar. Not quickly, not sideways. Directly, the way he looked at everything. "Yours has a better story than all of mine put together. You went into the Eastern Forest after something your family said was unlike anything they had seen. You killed it. That scar is proof you did something that mattered," he said plainly, without decoration. "You should be proud of it." Veyra was quiet for a moment. "That is kind of you to say," she said. "My family begs to differ." She smoothed the front of her shirt. "A cursed scar on a princess means she cannot be placed in any formal arrangement. She is a liability. So they gave me this posting, the boundary station nobody wanted, the village nobody else thought worth protecting, and they went on without me," Veyra said. She looked at the valley below, the familiar lights coming on one by one. 260 years. I file my reports every month and they sit in a drawer and no one comes out here and no one checks and no one asks," Veyra said. She said it without bitterness. Just fact. "I have made my peace with it, but I will not pretend it doesn't get lonely out here," Veyra said. Theo sat down on the ground beside her. "I know that feeling," he said. He was looking at the valley too, not at her, and it made it easier to say. "The village tolerates me. I bring them what they need and they let me stay, and that is a fair arrangement. But I have been working in that forest for years and no one has ever asked how it was out there. No one has sat with me and talked and actually listened, he said. He paused. You were the first. That evening with the coat, you said thank you and I stood on that path for 10 minutes because I did not know what to do with it, he said. He looked at her then. I am grateful every day that you are out here, Veyra. I mean that, Theo said. Veyra looked at him. The rain came down around them, soft and steady. The valley was going dark below. Neither of them moved. The distance between them was not very large. It got smaller. Veyra was looking at him and he was looking at her, and the rain was coming down around them and neither of them said anything. Theo's hand moved slightly toward hers on the ground between them. Veyra did not move away. She looked at his face and he looked at hers, and the distance got smaller still and... To be continued in Part 2.